You might want to sit down, officer, because what happens next won't go the way you think. The room hadn't heard those words yet, but somehow the tension was already there, thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. Just moments earlier, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom had swung open with a sharp echo, and every head turned at once as two uniformed officers dragged a woman inside. Ava Brooks didn't resist. She didn't plead. Her wrists were held together in front of her, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. To everyone watching, she looked like just another defendant pulled into a system that had already made up its mind. Officer Daniel Hayes walked beside her with a smirk that barely tried to hide itself, his voice low but loud enough for those closest to hear. "Let's see how confident you are in about 5 minutes," he muttered, as if the outcome had already been decided long before she ever stepped into the building. The courtroom itself felt cold, not in temperature, but in presence. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow across rows of wooden benches filled with quiet observers. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others sat back with the kind of detachment that comes from seeing too many cases just like this. A black woman in handcuffs. A police report already filed. A narrative already accepted. Ava was guided to the center of the room, where the polished floor reflected the faint outline of her silhouette. For a brief moment, everything slowed. The shuffle of papers, the distant cough from the back row, the subtle creak of wood as someone shifted in their seat. And in the middle of it all, Ava stood still. Too still. It was the kind of stillness that didn't match the situation. The kind that made you wonder if she knew something no one else did. Judge Robert Whitmore glanced down from the bench, his expression neutral but impatient, as if this was just another interruption in a long list of routine decisions. He tapped his pen once against the desk. "Let's move this along," he said flatly. Hayes stepped forward slightly, straightening his uniform as he prepared to speak, his confidence filling the space before his words even did. "Your Honor, we apprehended this individual earlier today following a report." But before he could finish, Ava lifted her eyes. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough. And for a split second, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. A pause. A hesitation that didn't belong to her. It belonged to the room. Imagine standing there, surrounded by people who have already decided who you are. Imagine hearing their assumptions before they even speak them out loud. And yet, saying nothing. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's timing. Ava's gaze moved briefly across the courtroom, not searching for help, not looking for sympathy, but observing, calculating, as if every detail mattered, as if every second counted. And somewhere in the background, unnoticed by most, a man in a dark suit sat quietly, pen in hand, watching everything unfold without saying a word. Hayes continued speaking, his voice growing more assured with every sentence, unaware that with each word, he was building something far bigger than a simple case. He thought he was in control. He thought this was routine. He thought she was just another name on a report. But the truth hadn't spoken yet. The air in the courtroom shifted, almost imperceptibly, as Officer Hayes continued speaking, his tone steady and confident, each word reinforcing the version of events he wanted everyone to believe, a version where everything was simple, controlled, and already resolved. "She refused to cooperate," he said, glancing briefly toward Ava as if expecting some reaction, some interruption, something that would confirm the role he had assigned her. But she gave him nothing. No protest, no visible frustration, just that same stillness, that same quiet presence that did not belong in a moment like this. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers tapping once against the polished wood as he listened, his attention drifting between the officer's report and the woman standing before him, as though weighing efficiency over curiosity. Around the room, whispers began to ripple softly, low enough to remain unacknowledged, but strong enough to shape perception. People were already deciding. They always did. Ava Brooks stood at the center of it all, her breathing slow and even, her gaze no longer scanning the room but fixed forward now, as if she had chosen her point of focus and refused to let it shift. There was something deliberate in that choice, something controlled. Imagine being surrounded by judgment and choosing silence anyway. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know exactly when to say it. Hayes took a step closer to the bench, his posture tightening as he continued outlining the alleged incident, his voice gaining momentum, growing more assured with each sentence. "We received a report from a private establishment," he added, his words carefully structured, and upon arrival, she matched the description given. When questioned, she became uncooperative and refused to provide clear identification. The statement hung in the air, neat and convincing, designed to close the gap between accusation and assumption. A few heads nodded subtly in agreement. It made sense. It always made sense when told this way. But then, something small broke the rhythm. Not a sound, not a movement, a delay. Judge Whitmore paused before responding, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. "No identification," he repeated, almost absent-mindedly, as if the detail had caught somewhere in his thoughts. Hayes hesitated for the briefest moment, barely noticeable, before answering. "Nothing valid, Your Honor." It was a clean answer. Too clean. Ava's fingers shifted slightly, a subtle movement at her side, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And someone was. The man in the dark suit, seated quietly near the back, continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the page without interruption, his attention never leaving the front of the room. Ava's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, as if a line had just been crossed, not by force, but by choice. Hayes straightened again, regaining his rhythm, unaware that the small crack in the narrative had already formed. "Given the circumstances," he continued, "we proceeded with detainment to bring her in for proper processing." The word detainment echoed slightly, heavier than the rest, settling into the space between authority and justification. The judge nodded once, slow and measured, his patience wearing thin. "Very well," he said, preparing to move forward, to reduce this moment to paperwork and procedure. And still, Ava said nothing. Not yet. Because timing, as it turns out, is not about speed. It is about precision. And somewhere between the officer's certainty and the judge's assumption, the truth was no longer waiting quietly. It was preparing to speak. Judge Whitmore adjusted his posture slightly, the faint sound of fabric brushing against leather breaking the stillness for a fraction of a second, as if even he could feel that something was not aligning as neatly as it should. His eyes moved from the paperwork back to Ava, studying her now with a touch more attention than before, not because she had spoken, but because she had not. Silence, when it lasts too long in a place built on arguments, begins to feel like defiance. "Miss Brooks," he said finally, his tone measured but edged with impatience, "you have the opportunity to respond to the officer's statement." The words hung there, an invitation that felt more like a formality than a genuine request. Ava did not answer right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, her eyes lifting just enough to meet the judge's gaze directly for the first time since she entered the room. There was no fear in that look, no urgency, just clarity, and something else, something that did not belong to someone in her position. Imagine expecting resistance and being met with composure instead. It unsettles you in ways you cannot immediately explain. Officer Hayes shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that betrayed a flicker of discomfort he did not fully recognize yet. He had seen hesitation before. He had seen denial, anger, panic. But this was none of those. Ava's voice, when it finally came, was calm and steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without ever rising. "I do have identification," she said. Simple, direct. The statement landed softly, but its impact was immediate. Hayes frowned, his brow tightening as he turned toward her. "You did not present anything at the scene," he replied quickly, his tone sharpening as if to reassert control. Ava did not look at him. Not yet. Her focus remained on the judge. "I was not asked in a way that required me to," she continued, her words chosen carefully, each one placed with intention. A quiet murmur spread again through the room, this time carrying a different tone, less certain, more curious. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his interest now fully engaged. "Are you saying you were not given the opportunity to identify yourself?" he asked, his voice no longer flat, but probing. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Ava spoke first, not louder, not faster, just precisely timed. "I am saying," she said, "that Assumptions were made before questions were completed. The courtroom seemed to tighten around that sentence. It was not an accusation shouted in anger. It was not a defense wrapped in emotion. It was something else entirely. Controlled. Exact. Difficult to dismiss. Hayes exhaled through his nose, a short, restrained breath as he straightened again, trying to regain the narrative slipping just slightly from his grasp. Your Honor, with all due respect, the situation required immediate action, he said, his voice firm, though not as smooth as before. We followed procedure. Procedure. The word echoed differently now, no longer a shield, but something being quietly examined. Ava's hands moved again, slowly this time, not in resistance, not in urgency, but with a purpose that drew attention without demanding it. The man in the dark suit paused his writing for the first time, his pen hovering just above the page. Ava's gaze finally shifted, not toward the judge, not toward the crowd, but toward Officer Hayes. And in that moment, the silence returned. Not empty, not passive, waiting. Because sometimes the truth does not rush to interrupt. Sometimes it waits until everyone is listening. Officer Hayes held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to read something beneath the surface, something that would return this moment to familiar ground. But there was nothing there he could grasp, nothing that fit into the pattern he was used to controlling. Then present it now, he said finally, his voice firm but edged with something quieter, something less certain than before. The request sounded simple, procedural, almost routine, but the weight behind it had shifted. This was no longer just about moving forward. It was about regaining control. Ava did not move immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch just a second longer, just enough for the room to lean in without realizing it. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached toward the inside pocket of her coat. The motion was calm, unhurried, but every eye in the courtroom followed it. Even the faint buzzing of the lights seemed to fade into the background as attention narrowed to that single, precise movement. Imagine a moment where everything pauses, not because it is forced to, but because no one wants to miss what comes next. Ava's fingers slipped inside the pocket, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and for the first time since she had entered the room, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that did not come from her, but from everyone else. Anticipation. Not loud, not spoken, but present. Hayes watched closely, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, as if preparing for something he could not yet define. Judge Whitmore leaned forward again, his earlier impatience replaced by focus, his eyes fixed on Ava's hand as it began to withdraw from her coat. The man in the dark suit at the back of the room stopped writing completely now, his pen resting against the paper, his attention fully locked on the unfolding moment. Ava pulled out a small object, held between her fingers, but did not raise it yet. She let it rest at her side, just visible enough to suggest, not reveal. Control. Timing. Precision. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to witness what was about to happen. Before I do, Ava said quietly, her voice steady, cutting through the silence without breaking it. I would like to clarify something for the record. Hayes shifted again, impatience flickering across his face. This is not the time for, it is exactly the time. Ava replied, not louder, not sharper, but certain, her tone leaving no room for interruption without making it feel like one. The judge raised a hand slightly, stopping Hayes before he could continue. Proceed, Whitmore said, his voice lower now, more measured. Ava nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before continuing. You stated that I refused to provide identification, she said, her eyes now moving briefly to Hayes, holding his gaze for just a second before returning to the judge. But what you did not state is that you never completed the question. A faint ripple moved through the room again, different this time, more focused, more attentive. Hayes opened his mouth, ready to respond, but paused, the words catching somewhere between intention and realization. Ava's hand lifted slightly, the object now more visible, though still not fully revealed. You assumed, she continued, her voice calm but carrying a weight that settled into every corner of the room, before you listened. The statement did not echo. It did not need to. It stayed where it was, sharp and clear. And for the first time, the certainty that had filled the room since she arrived began to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, Just enough. Because the moment was no longer moving forward the way it was supposed to. It was turning, and everyone could feel it. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty anymore. It felt charged, like something unseen had just stepped into the room and taken its place beside her. Officer Hayes straightened his posture again, but this time it was different, less natural, more forced, as if he were trying to return to a position that no longer fit the moment. "Your Honor," he said quickly, attempting to regain ground. "This is a distraction from the facts. We are here because she matched the description and refused to comply." His voice carried authority, but it no longer carried certainty. Judge Whitmore did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Ava, studying her with a level of attention that had not been there before, as if reevaluating not just her words, but the entire situation that had led to this point. Ava did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit, let it settle, because now the room was listening differently. Not to confirm what they believed, but to understand what they might have missed. Imagine realizing, in the middle of a story, that you have only been hearing one side. Ava lifted her hand slightly higher, the object between her fingers now catching the overhead light, reflecting a faint metallic glint that drew the eye without fully revealing itself. She did not present it yet. Not completely. Instead, she turned her wrist just enough for the judge to see the outline, but not enough for the rest of the room to understand. Control was not just about what you show. It was about when you choose to show it. "You mentioned a description," Ava said calmly, her voice steady, her tone unchanged, but the impact of her words landing differently now that the room had shifted. "I would like to know what that description was." The question was simple, almost procedural, but it carried weight. Hayes hesitated. Not long. Not enough for most to notice. But it was there. "A female individual matching her general appearance," he replied, his answer less precise than before, more vague than it should have been. Ava's eyes held his for a brief moment, not challenging, not aggressive, just present. "General appearance," she repeated softly, letting the words linger. Just long enough to be examined. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, subtle, quiet, but no longer indifferent. Judge Whitmore leaned forward again, his fingers now resting still against the desk, no longer tapping, no longer impatient. "Officer Hayes," he said, his tone measured but firmer now, "be specific." The request was simple, but it carried authority that could not be ignored. Hayes cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. The report indicated a black female, approximately mid-30s, wearing a dark coat, he said, his words coming slower now, as if each one required more thought than before. Ava nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if confirming something internally rather than reacting outwardly. "That description," she said quietly, "would apply to dozens of people within a 1-mile radius of where I was standing." No accusation, no raised voice, just a fact, placed carefully into the center of the room. The effect was immediate, though not loud. The narrative that had once felt solid now felt thinner, less defined, as if it could no longer hold its shape under closer inspection. Hayes shifted again, his confidence slipping in small, nearly invisible ways. "We acted based on the information we had," he said, his tone tightening slightly, leaning on procedure again, but it did not land the same way. Ava's hand moved just a little higher now, the object finally beginning to take form in the light, though still not fully revealed to everyone. The man in the dark suit leaned forward for the first time, his attention sharpened, his stillness replaced by anticipation. Ava's gaze returned to the judge, her voice steady, unwavering. "And I responded based on the information I was given," she said. The sentence settled into the room like a quiet turning point. Because now, it was no longer just about what happened. It was about how it happened. And more importantly, why? The room did not feel the same anymore, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. The confidence that once filled the space had thinned, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, like a structure beginning to shift beneath its own weight. Judge Whitmore's gaze remained fixed on Ava, no longer divided, no longer routine, but focused in a way that suggested this moment had become something more than just another case on his docket. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, his voice carrying a tone that invited clarity rather than dismissal, "you mentioned the way you were addressed. Explain that." Ava did not hesitate this time. The timing had been set. The room was ready. I was approached with a conclusion, she said, her voice calm, measured, each word landing with precision. Not a question. The distinction hung in the air, subtle but powerful. Hayes shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand brushing briefly against his belt as if grounding himself in something familiar. Your Honor, we cannot ignore the fact that she matched. We are not ignoring anything. Whitmore interrupted, his tone firm now, cutting through Hayes's attempt to regain control. We are clarifying. The word carried weight, heavier than procedure, heavier than assumption. Ava's hand, still holding the small object, rose slightly higher, now fully visible to the judge, though the rest of the room still could not clearly see what it was. She did not rush. She did not reveal. Not yet. Because now, every second mattered. Imagine being in a room where the truth is no longer hidden, but not yet spoken, where every person can feel it coming but cannot stop it. Ava turned her wrist just enough for the light to catch again, a faint glimmer reflecting across the polished surface of the bench. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of significance. Officer Hayes, Ava said, her voice shifting just slightly, not louder, but firmer, directed now. When you approached me, what was the first thing you said? The question was direct, unavoidable. Hayes hesitated. This time, it was clear. I informed you that you matched the description of a suspect, he replied, though the confidence behind the statement had begun to erode. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the answer. You told me, she said, her voice steady, that I fit what you were looking for. She paused just long enough for the words to settle, for the difference to register. You did not ask who I was. Silence. Not the passive kind. The kind that forces reflection. Hayes exhaled, a subtle tension building across his expression as the narrative he had constructed began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through detail. We followed standard procedure, he said again, but the repetition now sounded less like authority and more like defense. Ava's gaze held his for a moment longer, then shifted back to the judge. Procedure requires verification, she said, not assumption. The courtroom seemed to draw in collectively, the weight of that statement pressing against every surface. The man in the dark suit at the back of the room leaned forward further now, his presence no longer passive, his attention sharpened to a point. Ava's hand moved again, higher this time, no longer partially concealed. The object in her grasp was now unmistakably intentional, though still not fully revealed to everyone. The light caught its edge once more, brighter now, clearer. Hayes noticed it. His eyes flicked downward for a fraction of a second, then back up, something shifting behind them, something that had not been there before. Not fear. Not yet. But recognition, beginning. Ava's voice remained calm, controlled, unwavering. You saw what you expected to see, she said. The words did not accuse. They exposed. And in that moment, the balance in the room tilted just enough for everyone to feel it. Because the story was no longer about what she had done. It was about what he had assumed. And that difference was everything. The shift was no longer subtle now. It was undeniable, like a current running beneath the surface that everyone could feel, but no one could stop. Officer Hayes's eyes flickered once more toward Ava's hand, toward the object she held with such deliberate control, and for the first time since this began, his posture did not look like authority, it looked like calculation, as if he were trying to piece together something that should have been obvious much earlier. Judge Whitmore leaned forward further, his focus locked, his earlier impatience completely gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that filled the bench with a different kind of weight. Miss Brooks, he said, his voice lower now, more careful, you may present your identification. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the moment stretch just long enough for the anticipation to settle into every corner, for every pair of eyes to fix on her without distraction. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand higher, turning her wrist outward so that the object faced forward. The light caught it fully this time. No longer a hint. No longer a suggestion. A badge. Not just any badge. The design, the seal, the unmistakable structure of authority recognized at a federal level. A quiet, collective reaction moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp enough to be felt. Hayes did not speak. He did not move. His expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, but undeniable once you saw it. The certainty was gone. In its place was something else. Recognition. Ava's voice followed, calm, steady, unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of her timing. Special Agent Ava Brooks, she said, her words clear, precise, carrying across the courtroom without force. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Silence answered her. Not confusion, not disbelief. Silence that comes when a room realizes it has been wrong all along. Imagine standing in a place where you believed you understood the situation, only to find out you were the one being observed the entire time. Judge Whitmore straightened in his seat, his posture shifting as the weight of what he had just witnessed settled into place. Is this verified? He asked, though the question sounded less like doubt and more like process trying to catch up with reality. Ava lowered the badge slightly, but did not put it away. It is, she replied simply. At the back of the room, the man in the dark suit stood for the first time, his movement calm, but commanding attention without effort. He stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly, his presence no longer passive. Confirmed, he said, his voice firm, professional, carrying a tone that required no explanation. Hayes took a step back without realizing it, his mind catching up to a moment that had already passed him by. The narrative he had built, the confidence he had carried, the certainty he had relied on, all of it collapsed not with noise, but with truth. Ava's gaze moved to him once more, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more controlled. Understanding. You did not ask, she said quietly. The words were the same, but now they carried an entirely different weight. Because now, everyone understood exactly what they meant. And in that moment, the room did not just see Ava differently. It saw everything differently. No one spoke for a moment after the confirmation, and in that silence something far greater than a single misunderstanding began to unfold. It was not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. The balance of the room had shifted completely. Officer. Hayes stood still, his eyes no longer fixed with authority but searching, recalculating, as if trying to find a version of this moment that still placed him in control, but there was none. That version was gone. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat softly, the sound breaking the stillness just enough to bring structure back into the room. But even his voice carried a different weight now. Agent Brooks, he said, adjusting his tone with careful precision, you will be uncuffed immediately. The instruction was calm, but firm, no longer routine, no longer dismissive. One of the officers nearby moved quickly to comply, his movements careful, almost cautious, as if aware that every action now carried consequence. Ava did not rush. She did not react with relief or frustration. She simply stood there, composed, as if this outcome had never been in question. Imagine knowing the ending of a story long before everyone else catches up to it. The man in the dark suit stepped forward another pace, his presence now fully integrated into the center of the room, no longer an observer, but part of the unfolding authority. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady. This situation is part of an ongoing federal review. The words landed quietly, but their meaning expanded outward, filling the space with something far heavier than a single case. A review, not of one incident, of many. Hayes's head turned slightly, his attention snapping toward the man, the realization beginning to form not just about Ava, but about everything surrounding this moment. Ava lowered her badge slightly, but kept it visible, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in something that no longer needed to prove itself. Officer Hayes, she said, her voice calm, not accusatory, not raised, but impossible to ignore. This was not the first report. The statement did not seek reaction. It revealed pattern. Hayes swallowed, his jaw tightening as pieces began to connect, pieces he had not been aware were being watched, recorded, evaluated. We have been documenting interactions, Ava continued, her tone steady, each word placed with precision, specifically those where procedure is replaced by assumption. The courtroom did not react outwardly, but the weight of her words settled into every corner, into every person who had been watching, listening, judging. Judge Whitmore sat straighter now, his earlier role as passive overseer replaced by something more active, more accountable. Are you indicating, he asked carefully, that this extends beyond today? Ava met his gaze directly. Yes, she answered. Simple, direct, final. The man in the dark suit opened a slim folder in his hands, the soft sound of paper shifting cutting through the tension. Multiple incidents have been flagged, he said, his tone professional, controlled. And this courtroom was selected as part of a controlled observation. A controlled observation. The phrase echoed differently, not just as information, but as realization. This had not been random. This had not been chance. Hayes took another small step back, his confidence now fully replaced by something else entirely. Awareness, not just of what had happened, but of how long it had been building without his knowledge. Ava's eyes rested on him once more, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity. You thought you were responding to a situation, she said quietly, but you were being observed in one. The words settled into the space between them, unshaken, undeniable. And in that moment, the courtroom understood that this was no longer about one woman being brought in. It was about an entire system being quietly, carefully, and completely seen. The weight of what had just been revealed did not fade. It settled deeper, pressing into the room with a quiet authority that no one could ignore or dismiss. Judge Whitmore remained still for a moment, his hands resting firmly on the bench, his eyes moving between Ava Brooks, Officer Hayes, and the man in the dark suit, as if recalibrating not just the case before him, but his role within it. This court will acknowledge the federal oversight immediately, he said finally, his voice steady but carrying a gravity that had not been there before, and all related reports will be reviewed in full. The statement was not dramatic, but it marked a clear shift, a recognition that the structure he presided over was no longer insulated from what had just come to light. Officer Hayes stood motionless, his earlier confidence now replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than any reaction could have been. He was no longer speaking, no longer guiding the narrative, no longer certain of the ground beneath him. Imagine realizing that the authority you relied on was never absolute, that it depended on something you overlooked entirely. Ava lowered her hand completely now, the badge no longer needed. As proof, because its presence had already changed everything that mattered. She did not step forward. She did not claim victory. She simply stood, composed, as if the outcome was not a triumph, but a correction. The man in the dark suit closed his folder with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound echoing just enough to draw attention without demanding it. This concludes the observation phase, he said, his tone calm and professional, and initiates the accountability process. The words were precise, controlled, and final in a way that left no room for interpretation. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom, not chaotic, not emotional, but reflective, as if everyone present was beginning to understand the larger implications of what they had witnessed. Ava's gaze shifted one last time to Officer Hayes. There was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just clarity. It was never about one moment, she said softly. It was about a pattern. The sentence did not accuse. It revealed. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight he carried had finally become visible, even to himself. There were no words he could offer that would restore what had already been undone. No explanation that could rewrite what had already been seen. Judge Whitmore nodded once, a small, deliberate acknowledgement, before signaling for the proceedings to be formally paused. The gavel did not strike loudly. It did not need to. The decision had already been made long before that sound. As people began to shift in their seats, to stand, to process what had just unfolded, the atmosphere remained different, quieter, heavier, but clearer. Because something had been exposed, not through force, not through confrontation, but through truth presented at exactly the right moment. Ava turned slightly, preparing to leave the center of the room, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she carried the same calm into whatever came next. And as she walked, there was no applause, no reaction, just silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of understanding. Because in that room, on that day, authority had been questioned, assumptions had been exposed, and justice had not raised its voice. It had simply revealed itself. He thought he was in control of the situation. But in the end, he learned something far more difficult to face. Control means nothing when truth is the one asking the questions.